Hello, today's talk should be shorter than the full-length Conquered and the Proud episodes, but it's related to that, although it'll also stand alone. Today we're going to talk about Augustus and his extended family, and we'll look at a few family trees, and we'll look at how so many people die apparently prematurely under potentially suspicious circumstances, but it's the quantity as much as the individual fates of these members that make people wonder a bit. And obviously you have in Robert Graves's novel like Claudius, and then the BBC adaptation in particular, pushing this to an extreme, taking all the rumours of Suetonius and other accounts and assuming that Livia is this arch manipulator, this and they still portray her as very able and as keeping the empire working, and in fact perhaps saving it from Augustus's mistaken instincts at times, but utterly ruthless, utterly cold. You have that marvellous scene where she gets Claudius to promise to make her a goddess once he's emperor, and he then asks for the truth. He's, what's happened? I'm a historian. I'm so interested in the truth. And they go through a list. She sort of talks through about various people and says, yes, well, I murdered him. And then, no, I didn't kill your father, but I'd marked him for death and all this sort of stuff. It's a wonderful scene. It's part of what makes that drama so special and how well done it was. But also it's jumping beyond the facts and the information we have. It is a possible interpretation, but it is far from being the only interpretation. So I thought as a separate thing, and this ties in with some of the Q&A videos, so the one for instance about Augustus and Tiberius, that we'll talk about more elsewhere as well. But let's look at Augustus and his family at different stages, and then we'll talk through what's going on. I'm going to make use of the very nice family trees that were in my biography of Augustus, and I can say very nice and compliment them because they were produced for me by David Breeze, the very distinguished archaeologist and expert particularly on the Roman frontiers, the Limes generally, Hadrian's Wall in particular, Antonine Wall, the lot. A great scholar who just, out of the kindness of his heart and because he enjoys this sort of thing, offered to do these for me. So I'll flash those up and then we'll go through it and we'll look at some of the aspects of it. So let's start in 30 BC and see who we've got. So you've got Augustus himself, who'd been married first of all to Scribonia. We don't know when she died. That produced one child who lived. It's always difficult to know with ancient sources whether infants that died very, very young or were stillborn get mentioned at all. Probably in the main they don't, but that's the only legitimate child, the only known child of the Emperor Augustus. Augustus divorced Scribonia for personality clashes, basically, sort of irreconcilable differences, or what is it, creative differences they talk about on films, and got Livia's husband, Tiberius Claudius Nero, forced him to divorce her so that he could marry her. Again, we've talked about this a bit before in the earlier lecture on the rise of Augustus. Livia was pregnant with Drusus, her son, having already born Tiberius. We've got those down there. And she was, whilst Augustus got betrothed to him, and then within days of Drusus being born, they had a wedding ceremony. Tiberius Claudius Nero had to give away his former right act in the place of her father, who wasn't around anymore, and they married. Now, one source talks about Livia becoming pregnant at some point in the years to come and suffering a very bad miscarriage, and from then on, she and Augustus never have any children. However, he doesn't divorce her. This is his third wife, and yet they remain married. So you have to look and think, well, why? And personally, I know this is a terribly unfashionable thing to say, I think they actually loved each other. I think this was an important bond to him. Yes, you can talk about Livia and say that on both sides she's from very distinguished aristocratic families, and she was revered as a great beauty and all this sort of thing, but there are other women like that at Rome. And it's not until later that Augustus is pushing the whole family life and family values. And of course the irony is that whilst he introduces legislation that penalises anyone who doesn't have 3 children, any citizen, then he only has the 1 child himself, though he does adopt others. On the other side, you've still got Octavia, Augustus' sister. She's been married to Gaius Claudius Marcellus, consul, one of the men who was sort of leading the opposition to Julius Caesar, but then didn't fight against him in the Civil War, and has had her son Marcellus, 2 daughters. She's then been married to Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, of course, after his other earlier wife Fulvia died. He'd had 2 children with her, 2 sons, Antonius Antillus and Iulus Antonius. He has 2 daughters with Octavia, Antonia 1 and 2, major and minor. So you have a family there. Now, the older boy by Fulvia, from Mark Antony's son, Antillus, he is executed in the aftermath of Actium and the invasion of Egypt in 30 BC. So he's considered, but Iulus Antonius, who is that much younger, has not come of age, is still a child, grows up in the household of Octavia. So that's quite interesting. He will feature later on, and he will be involved in an element of scandal with the younger Julia. But it does show that Augustus is not wiping out the family lines of his opponents, his big rival Antony. But Octavia has children. She's raising this household with half a dozen children in, and she doesn't remarry after this. So let's move on to 19 BC, and we'll see how things look there, because that's our starting point. But this is by which time you've had both the first settlement, as we call it, and the second settlement in 23 BC. Augustus has established what will in fact become the principal basis of the Principate, tribunician power, maius imperium proconsularia, the way the empire works. He's establishing himself as leader of the Senate, first among equals, creating a stable regime that will last. And it's by now, abundantly clear that although there are rumours that he considers resigning or laying down his powers, and there are threats to this a few times, but people pressure him to know not to, you feel this regime is taking on an air of permanence. So let's look at the families now. You've still got the same basic setup. As I say, Augustus and Livia do not have any children of their own that live. Julia has been married to Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. So Augustus's contemporary and school friend he's described as, or implied, the man who's led the fleets that crushed Sextus Pompey, won the Battle of Actium, the man who gets things done, the military man, but also the very practical man. He'd earlier been married, interestingly enough, to a Caecilia Attica. Now that's the daughter of Atticus, the correspondent of Cicero. You have all these letters to Atticus. That's his daughter. And it shows how Atticus, who'd had very good connections with all the leading families, knew people close with Brutus, close with Pompey, close with all the people who opposed Caesar, also managed to be very close with all the people who, to less extent Julius Caesar, but particularly supported Augustus. Had that, he's a great survivor, knows the right people, never enters politics directly, but is always connected with those who are on top. One of the children they've had is Vipsania, who will marry Tiberius, Livia's son, older son. So let's see, let's go over and look at we've got he's also married possibly Marcella and daughter. Sorry, no, we've got this, that's the way around. Yeah, they've got the daughter possibly there. Marcella has now been married to Iulus Antonius, so there's connecting the family who produces another Antonius, Lucius Antonius. So Antony's family line does continue for a considerable time. You've got one of the Antonias married to Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. Again, that leads the line that will produce the Emperor Nero. Antonia is married to Drusus, the younger son of Livia. So there's lots of intermarriage, apparently at quite close degrees, some of this, but there's very much, the biggest, perhaps the shocking one, is the marriage of Agrippa to Julia, because she is so much younger than him. And that's her second marriage. So it's shows just how complicated this is, but how you're building. There is a sense, people seem to sense this from early on, that you have a royal family forming, or an imperial family, and they start to look at who's connected to power and all this sort of thing. And the natural thing, particularly with hindsight and particularly in the modern world, is to look and say, well, is Augustus marking out a successor? Marcellus, the son of Octavia, his sister, his nephew, therefore, appears to be favoured at one point, appears to be prominent, but dies young, so he's out of the picture under mysterious circumstances. Again, Claudius, it's Livius, had him poisoned. And then you move on to, she says, well, we need Agrippa more, so that's the marriage to Julia, because you've had the earlier link between Marcellus and Julia that doesn't produce children. She does. Agrippa's as thorough at being a sort of family man and a father as he is at doing anything else. So there are quickly, it's Gaius, there's Lucius, there's a daughter as well. So you're having a picture of this bigger, as I say, a dynasty emerging, a royal or imperial family emerging, but it's all still very complicated. So let's go on to the end of the decade, 10 BC, and see what's happening there. So you can see that you've now got the 5 children between Julia and Agrippa. The last one, Agrippa Posthumus, you can tell from the name, was actually born. The third son is born after Agrippa has died. Now, there are all sorts of stories about Julia and her affairs that obviously is a big feature we'll deal with in a moment. One of the collection of jokes recorded to her, ascribed to her later on in this late source, talks about how, she basically apparently joked, well, all the children look like their father. And she said, yes, that's because I don't take on a new passenger until I've already got cargo in the hold, implying that she sort of waits till she's pregnant before she has intercourse with others. Again, how reliable these jokes and stories are. But they're, generally speaking, there seems to be a sense, the belief is that these are all legitimate children of Agrippa. Gaius and Lucius, the 2 oldest boys, will be adopted by Augustus as sons. They're literally his grandsons, but they become adopted sons. Agrippa has, however, died in 12 BC. Circumstances of that, he's of an age where it's not unusual for a Roman to die, but nevertheless, because he's connected with Augustus, there's always rumour, there's always suspicion about anything that happens. Tiberius has been married to his daughter, Vipsania, and this is famous enough that it's played up well in Claudius, but there's even the joke about it in an episode of Frasier, in the old series, that was quite nicely done, where Niles is the only one who understands the allusion that Frasier makes to this. But anyway, when Agrippa dies, fairly soon afterwards, Tiberius divorces Vipsania and marries Julia. So you have this dynamic, and there is the tradition that he didn't want to do it, that he was still in love with Vipsania and used to sort of look longingly at her afterwards. He and Julia clearly did not get on. Again, there is possibly a pregnancy, but that doesn't carry through. They do just seem to have been different temperaments, people who probably should not, under any circumstances, have been married, grow to hate each other, and then this is part of the context of Tiberius going off and going into this sort of voluntary exile, living on roads for all those years, which we've talked about a little bit in the Augustus and Tiberius video. We're obviously trying to cover in this an awful lot of history, an awful lot of events, and it's quite complicated. So you have this development. Drusus is still around, he's still campaigning, but in 9 BC, just a year after this family tree, he's going to take a fall from a horse while on campaign, injure his leg badly, the wound turns bad, and he dies. As I say, in Claudius, it's Livia is supposed to say, oh, well, I was planning on killing him, I'd got him on my list, but in fact, nature did it for me, so I didn't have to. because of this theme that Graves pushes the idea that there are people who are out there who want to restore the Republic. There is a thing, and we'll develop this when we talk more about Augustus and the provinces, where you can see Tiberius and Drusus as the latest generation of a very distinguished republican aristocratic family, an old aristocratic family, so that they are people of importance even without their connection to Augustus. That's fine, but they get far more opportunities. They're commanding armies in their 20s in a way would never happen under conventional times, under the old rules. So it's they are certainly, the imperial connection is an important one. It's also worth saying that, again, something I will develop when I'm talking about the provinces, that Augustus almost has a team of leading men at any one time. He very rarely is doing everything himself. So you have the partnership with Agrippa, and Agrippa gets Maius Imperium Proconsulare. People get powers like that. They even get Tribunician Potestas, the power of the rights of the tribunate and the sacrosanctity of various times. So they're marked down as colleagues almost in the imperial post. So I do sometimes wonder if Augustus actually thinks that the best way of ruling things is with a team of Principes, almost something like the Tetrarchy of Diocletian, where you have him as the senior man because he is Augustus, because he is a Caesar, because he has done so many things. They cannot compete with that. Therefore, you have people who are either younger relatives or people like Agrippa who don't come from the right sort of family that will do a lot of the work, that will share the burden, because there is an immense amount to be done. And having people you can trust, putting them in command, avoids the risk that you'd had in the Republic, whereby it's the Pompeys, it's the Caesars, it's the Sullas who get command of an army, win a victory, and then lead those armies against the state and seize power by force. So you have a growing family. Drusus has got children. You've got Germanicus, Livilla, Claudius, of course. You've got others, Claudia Pulchra, Valerius Massala, Lucius Antonius. Again, Iulus Antonius is still around at this point. He will eventually be, compelled to suicide, effectively. So it's quite a broad family, but what's going to happen in the next 20 years in particular will severely deplete it and cause serious problems. You will have, soon after this, the promotion of Gaius and Lucius. Now, part of this comes through the people electing them consul, Gaius in particular first, when Augustus apparently doesn't want this to happen, but at a young age. So you're still getting these sort of ratifications. You're supposed to have a list of candidates given by Augustus that the people will simply pass through on the nod almost, and approve. Occasionally they break those rules, but in a way they consider to be flattering to Augustus and try and promote other members of his family. So you have that going on. You have the rift between Julia and Tiberius, Tiberius withdrawal to exile. Drusus has died as a result of this accident. So you've lost Agrippa, you've lost Drusus, you've effectively lost Tiberius in that he's no longer a functioning member. You promote Gaius and Lucius when they're very, very young, even compared to the opportunities given to Tiberius and Drusus. They are given chances, and they both die very young. Gaius takes a wound and possibly has, there's talks about him losing his mental balance as well as the wound not really healing, and he eventually dies. It is all quite fishy. I mean, if you look at this seems a very high mortality rate for any one family. On the other hand, some families are unlucky, and particularly in the pre-modern age, before modern medicine, you can look at some family lines, and the number of children who died young, or even adults who died comparatively young, is quite staggering by our standards. So it's not impossible, but you do keep feeling there's perhaps more than just coincidence going on with some of this. Germanicus is still too young. So there's a period when Gaius and Lucius are off the scene and Tiberius is still in disfavour, in retirement, however you choose to see it, where Augustus is starting to rely on people who are more distant members of his extended family. And that's where you get people like Varus, Quintilius Varus, in command in Germany in AD 9. He's married into the family, first the family of Agrippa and then of Augustus himself, but at a fairly sort of removed degree. He's not one of the top men. He's not being given exceptional careers, but nevertheless some connection with Augustus and his family, or Agrippa and his family, does seem to have helped your career, helped consider the loyalty. So let's look at the family right at the end, when Augustus dies in AD 14. There's obviously far fewer of them. Tiberius has by now been adopted son of Augustus. He's started to receive the rights of the princeps. He's had tribunician potestas. He's had on more than one occasion maius imperium proconsulare. So he's basically ready to step into Augustus's shoes when Augustus dies. Although there's still some confusion over to this, because remember, this has never happened before. There hasn't been a succession before, and Tiberius does seem to have been a rather awkward man. He comes across as someone who was very able, very diligent, very hard-working, who did a lot for the state, but just had that knack of being misunderstood, of rubbing people up the wrong way, in utter contrast to the charming Augustus. Augustus could make people laugh and relieve a tense situation, and was far more relaxed about things, didn't take things personally, perhaps because he had so little to prove. Tiberius didn't really have a lot to prove. I mean, his record is extremely good, militarily in particular, and administratively. But there's this sense, you have the Tacitan account where he almost does the sort of thing. I mean, it's almost very English, really. It's the sort of thing that I would do, or everybody else would do, when people, the Senate, are saying, well, we'd really like you to take over, and he says, oh, well, it's a hard job, I'm not sure I'm up to it, and then they say, well, which bits would you like to do? At which point he hastily says, no, actually, I'm sure I can do it. It's all this, but it's difficult. He lacks that Augustan touch, but it's also harder because, again, by AD 14, how many people can really remember a time before Augustus? It's been 44 years since Actium and the death of Antony, and this man has been running the state, and everything has changed. So if you're an adult, particularly an adult old enough to be in the Senate, you really don't remember life beforehand, and those few memories you have, they're not good, because that was a time of chaos, civil war, political murder, all of this. So you have Tiberius, you have... he's got Drusus and others, his son. You've got Germanicus. He's adopted Germanicus. So you have something of the next generation. Germanicus is old enough and is starting to show talent as a commander and will campaign on the Rhine. But then again, he's not going to last too long. By 19, he's dead as well. Drusus never quite seems to show the same talent or be given the same opportunity, but will also die prematurely. It's what happens afterwards. When you look at the wider family, many of these people are going to die young, be arrested, be exiled, in some cases executed. Posthumous Agrippa goes within days or weeks of Augustus's death, again on whose orders, hard to say, but he's a potential rival. He'd been discredited, he'd been forced into exile for gross immorality. It's very vague. In I Claudius they have a sort of faked attempt at, he's framed as if he tried to rape is it Drusilla or Livilla? I can't remember. Livilla, I think. That's right, it's Livilla. They have. We don't know. There is a tradition that he was too violent and aggressive. That he liked the bloodshed of the gladiatorial games too much. There was something wrong with him. On the other hand, it's very hard to say. The big exile, obviously, there's been this problem with Julia and her children. Julia herself has been exiled for gross immorality, repeated affairs, having a feast and orgy on the speaker's platform in the forum, doing all this publicly, doing it with aristocrats from, there's a Gracchus involved. There are people from the big, established, famous families. So some scholars will say, well, that suggests there's a political overtone, but it's probably also just the social circles connected to the bright young things of Rome of this era tend to have these big family names, and you can feel very sorry for Julia because she's been sort of carted around and just married off to different people just there to produce children, and yet expected to behave with great dignity. And again, there's a flattering tradition to her. You get these jokes, these stories. She's criticised for sometimes being over made up and wearing too much jewellery, and she says, well, sometimes I dress for my husband, sometimes I dress for my father, so I can be dignified, respectable, but also I can be the attractive woman to my husband, trying to please him. You have, of course, there's the marvellous scene in the at the BBC Claudius, where you have Brian Blessed going along as Augustus along this line of people asking them, have you slept with my daughter? And you sort of have things like, not slept, Caesar, and oh, it was standing up, was it? All this sort of thing. And the impression is that there's probably some accuracy in the sources that Augustus didn't realise what was going on because nobody told him. And again, you have to remember there is an element where with any monarchy, even celebrity, you get to that point a court forms where everybody wants something from the person with the ability to dispense favours, promotions, high office, riches, all of these things. And therefore they don't ever tell them the truth, they only tell them what they think will please them. And it might well be that he's naive. I mean, many people are when it comes to their own family, particularly their own children. She is exiled and sent off to an island to live on her own without companionship. You know, Augustus is supposed to inspect even the slaves that are sent there if they're male, so that nobody who's at all good looking goes anywhere near her. It is, of course, a huge embarrassment when this is a regime that has pushed family values, traditional virtue, restoration of the good old days and how we behave, all this sort of things. But it is hard to see it as a major political thing or an attempted coup or all this thing, in spite of the people involved. It does seem to be a personal thing. There's also an element, this sort of feasting is not so very different from the wild parties that the young Octavian had had. Possibly even the marriage to Livia, and the feast where they all dress up as gods and goddesses while there's a famine on in Rome and all this sort of thing. So this is Julia doing things, but doing things now in an environment where she's expected to behave in a certain way. She gets caught. On several occasions, there are popular protests, including some at the games, at the theatre, where crowds ask for the recall of Julia. It shows that she is still quite popular, and it's sort of seen as, oh, well, she misbehaved, but it wasn't terrible, she's not doing anything really evil, all this sort of thing. Augustus refuses, and there's some mitigation of her circumstances for captivity, but it isn't ever relieved. And then a little bit later, a scandal involving the poet Ovid, probably the younger Julia, is also accused of immorality, promiscuity, whatever it might be, perhaps with a slightly more political element here, because you have the young child of Antony involved in this. She's exiled as well. So you have the mother, the daughter, and one of the sons, Posthumus, exiled. You have Gaius and Lucius, who managed to avoid the scandal, who remain Augustus' sons, partly perhaps because they've condemned their mother publicly and all this sort of thing, but also you can't really spare them. But they don't last long. They both die. So it ends up with Tiberius being almost the last candidate. And it comes back to the theme of the video we had before about Augustus and Tiberius and their relationship. Whether the recall and the adoption is Augustus bringing him into line because now he has the powers of a father over him, or also Tiberius winning because, well, now I'm going to be the heir. The only thing is, it's hard to know when you come with personal motivation, is that, and they even hint about this in I Claudius and in the BBC drama, you really feel that Tiberius, by the time Augustus died, would have been better off just retiring, that he didn't want to do the job. He did it out of duty, perhaps ambition as well, the two will often go together, but that he doesn't really want to be emperor. He doesn't want to do the dull job that this has become, the drudgery of it, that Augustus dutifully performed right the way throughout his life. And Tiberius does his best, and on the whole you feel rules the empire pretty well, but is just not the man for the job anymore. You needed somebody a bit younger, a bit more active, but again, that's how it works out. It is remarkable when you go from how big this family tree is at certain times to how small it ends up with. The number of people who last through, the number of his extended family who actually outlive Augustus is surprisingly small, given his poor health at various stages in his life, and then many more of those will fall by the wayside. The big story of the Julio-Claudians is that they pretty much exterminate themselves, or they die. The line fails from being quite big, having lots of people. Tiberius doesn't have, after his son Drusus dies, again, mysterious circumstances, we'll get onto that when we talk on that period. Germanicus has gone as well. He doesn't have anyone the equivalent of them, or himself and his brother Drusus, or even Gaius and Lucius, let alone Agrippa, that he can trust to go off and give big responsibility to in the provinces. So that affects the way he rules the empire, and it probably affects expansion, the way that the empire develops, simply this lack of people that you can trust. This will be even more true of subsequent emperors, because at least Tiberius has a very distinguished, proven military record. He has been a successful commander. He's won a lot of campaigns. He's done it. And people like Caligula, Claudius, Nero, many later emperors do not have that reputation, which makes it much more dangerous for them to entrust senior senators with the responsibilities that will give them a glory that they lack. So the story is, it's very hard to tell what's going on. We'll never know how many, if any, of these people perished to malice, to poison, to arranged accidents, as opposed to natural causes. The ancient world was a dangerous place. So you can have the I Claudius view of it all. You don't have to, and I think the I Claudius view is certainly pushed too far. However, you do get a sense that Livia is involved in assisting Augustus in a big way. She travels with him a lot. I mean, this is one of the big differences we talked about a little bit in the lecture on officers' wives in the Roman army. It's under Augustus that the women and even the children sometimes start to travel with members of the imperial family when they go on tours of the provinces, even when they go off to war. That's never been the case in the Republic. So this is a big, big break with tradition. It's why somebody like Claudius will be born in Lugdunum in Gaul. And why Agrippina will play a role in helping to quell the mutiny in AD 14, but also in receiving back the columns that have had a rough time in the campaigns in Germany. She's there waiting with rations, with bandages, to greet the men as they come back in across the bridge into the Roman province over the Rhine. So there's a different role. And people like Livia, in the same way you get from Suetonius these private letters between Augustus and Livia talking about what should we do with Claudius, for instance. They're clearly making decisions about the family jointly. So she clearly is very politically important, very politically savvy, extremely intelligent, knowledgeable, and capable. Whether that is entirely used for good, or she has the personal agenda of wanting her son to be the next emperor, which is the motivation in I Claudius, much, much harder to say, and we'll never know. The striking thing about Livia is, even though she's more prominent than most women have been in the Republic, and the same could be true of Octavia, Julia to some extent until her fall, her power is wielded behind the scenes. And it's all the more successful because she is the manipulator. But it's hence the comment attributed to Caligula that sees Ulixes Stolatus, Ulysses in a dress, basically Ulysses in a frock. The great Odysseus Ulysses, the great schemer, manipulator, liar, the man with many a cunning plan that gets the Greeks into Troy, with the Trojan horse, rather than the direct courage and valor of somebody like Achilles. She's very smart. She's very important. It would be so lovely if we'd actually had the chance, like the Claudius in the I Claudius series, of asking her, what really happened? What's the truth behind all this? But that's the sort of thing. This is behind closed doors. This is what's happening within the family. You don't know this very much today in of so many important families. It's even harder for the ancient world. So most of what's going on will remain a mystery. But that's just makes it all the more intriguing. But we have to be aware all these people are individual human beings with the virtues and the flaws, the vices, the skills of people. And their personality mattered in these big events. But how much it mattered and how it played out, we don't know. So that's just an introduction to the extended family of Augustus and Livia and the implication of what's going on. So looked at the family trees, we've looked at the high mortality rate. It's given us an idea of just what's going on. So this is really an appendix almost to the Conquered and the Proud talks on Augustus and the creation of the Augustan regime and the politics of that period, and a little bit of what follows on, and it fits in more with the shorter answers as well. So I thought I'd do this separately just because it's worth it. However, I'll give the same piece of advice that I always used to give to my students. If you really want to sort out the imperial family in your head, go and watch the BBC I Claudius. Whatever you think about it as dramatically, and I'm a big fan, I think it works very well. It's of its time, but nevertheless, it works well, and it does exaggerate. it's so much easier to sort these people out if you put a face to them. And even if you think Sejanus, who'll come along, and Tiberius is Patrick Stewart with a wig on, before he commanded the Starship Enterprise and all this sort of thing, you remember him, you identify them. It's much harder with particularly the very formulaic images, the statuary and busts of the Julio-Claudian family, especially under Augustus. Augustus remains serenely young throughout his life. Livia is much the same. There's no image of an elderly Livia or Octavia or any of the others. So, although you do get that a little bit with some of the later emperors, on the whole they're all depicted as these sort of ageless, rather perfect looking individuals, though particularly the Claudians with quite big ears. They seem to be prominent to some extent. So sort yourself, once you've got them as faces, as characters, remember that what you're being presented with is not simple, straightforward, factual history. It's an interpretation. But in terms of sorting out Gaius and Lucius and Posthumus and all the others and the various daughters, and then some sense of the marriage that's often between cousins and all this sort of thing, that's a very good way of doing it. So I'd recommend it just on grounds that it's good entertainment, but also it's actually quite a useful way of sorting out this very, very complicated family. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching.